Good afternoon, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this important event. My name is Martin Gaynor. I'm the Lester A. Hamburg University Professor of Economics and Public Policy here at the Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon and Special Advisor to Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Kanter at the Antitrust Division, U.S. Department of Justice. I'll be joining Mr. Kanter for an informal fireside chat after his remarks. As we all know, healthcare is one of the most important sectors of our economy. It's not only large, $1 every 5 in the United States goes to healthcare. We spend over $13,000 for every woman, man, and child in the country, and that this is when our federal poverty line is around $18,000. It's one of the largest sources of employment in the entire country, but it also is critically important because of the impacts on our health and well-being. However, our healthcare system doesn't work as well as it could or as it should. Costs are high and getting higher, straining the abilities of average Americans to pay for healthcare, while the health of many of us is stagnant or getting worse. Adequate healthcare can be difficult to access. Medical bills are arbitrary, incomprehensible, untimely, and often incorrect, and healthcare workers often toil under poor working conditions and receive low pay. Outside of that, we're doing great. Look, I'm an economist. It's my job to put the dismal in the dismal science, so there you go. Now, Pittsburgh, where we are here, exemplifies both the best and the worst of U.S. healthcare. We have extraordinarily skilled and dedicated caregivers, institutions that invest in state-of-the-art medical technology and information technology and path-breaking innovations in medicine. However, we also have a healthcare system with market dominance and little competition, where patients have limited choices about where to receive treatment, healthcare workers have little choice about where to work, and the dominant firm engages in bare-knuckles tactics reminiscent of the robber barons that dominated this region so long ago. It's therefore appropriate, timely, and important that we gather here today to hear about and discuss U.S. healthcare and what to do about it. It's now my pleasure to introduce Carnegie Mellon's Provost and Chief Academic Officer and the Thomas Lord Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Jim Garrett. Jim is a nationally recognized engineer and lifelong Tartan and has been a steadfast supporter of Carnegie Mellon's engagement with important policy issues and policymakers and of the research and education that make our university a key contributor to advancing public policy. Please join me in welcoming Provost Garrett.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'll call you Professor Gaynor first, and then I'll refer to you as Marty from now on. Thank you, Marty, for that very nice, warm introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with so many colleagues from the Heinz College and beyond for today's discussion. It's a very important topic, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. As Marty said, healthcare in America is a topic that just continues to be at the forefront of national policy considerations and conversations for all the reasons that Marty just said. It's an important issue that the Heinz College approaches with data, technology, and a commitment to finding solutions that positively impact society. And to that end, it's a true pleasure to be part of today's discussion with our special guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before I do want to thank Dean Krishnan, who I understand is not able to be here today, but I do want to thank him nonetheless, Marty and the entire Heinz leadership team for facilitating this very important conversation and many others like this on our campus. So let's give the Heinz College and Dean Krishnan and Professor Gaynor a big round of applause for sponsoring this event. Thank you. So now I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Jonathan Kanter. In 2012, Mr. Cantor was confirmed as Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And in this role, he's responsible for the direction and execution of antitrust enforcement and competition policy at the Department of Justice. And throughout his career, Mr. Cantor has been a leading advocate for strong and meaningful antitrust enforcement and competition policy. And as an acknowledged global leader in antitrust, his work has focused on emphasizing aggressive enforcement and innovative, forward-looking approaches. He's committed to making healthcare one of the largest and most important sectors of the U.S. economy, again, as Marty has already made very clear, work to the benefit of all Americans. We're very fortunate to have Assistant Attorney General Cantor with us today, and I and hopefully all of you look forward to his speech and fireside chat to follow. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Cantor. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost, and it's just wonderful to be here and to see so many people gathering for this really important and meaningful discussion. Before I jump in, I did want to take a moment of personal privilege and extend my gratitude to Professor Gaynor, or as known to me, Marty, who is not only one of the nation's leading scholars and for me, advisors on issues of healthcare and antitrust and competition. He is an incredibly empathetic, caring person who wants to contribute and has contributed so meaningfully to making our healthcare system better, to improving antitrust enforcement in this area. He's been invaluable to the Department of Justice, his previous tenure at the FTC, and his contributions going forward will make us all better off. So, Marty, thank you. The time has come to fundamentally redefine our approach to antitrust and competition policy for healthcare. For the past 3 years, I've had the privilege to connect with people across the country. In the coming weeks, I will take time to reflect on my time and experiences at the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and to tout our tremendous achievements. But not today. Throughout the country, I've heard deep-seated concern about the growth and expansion of monopoly power and monopsony power across our country and economy. In nearly every corner of our nation, in nearly every industry, the story remains startlingly consistent. People want the opportunity to build better lives for themselves. They don't want handouts. They want to work hard and reap just rewards. They want a free and fair economy. Despite these admirable and righteous aspirations, however, too many people find that pathways to economic freedom are limited, shrinking, or worse, non-existent. It is extremely striking to me that almost every conversation I have with concerned Americans eventually and inevitably turns to healthcare. I hear stories of patients trying to get coverage for their prescription medication, a medication that they've been taking for years, only to hear that it's no longer a preferred drug. This means for many patients paying more, having to switch to another drug with potentially adverse side effects, or dealing with their insurer's Byzantine step process to try to get coverage for original medication. I hear stories of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, caregivers who are burned out and disillusioned as their work increasingly devolves into battling corporate middlemen to secure care for their patients as provider roll-ups encourage cutting corners and short staffing. I hear the collective state of despair from patients, families, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and healthcare professionals about the endless maze of paperwork and faceless middlemen that have overwhelmed the practice and receipt of medicine. For patients, the paperwork you get in connection with healthcare is about as valuable as that online privacy policy that you click through. And I hear stories about how many Americans need to pay more money out of their own pockets, despite paying hand over fist for health insurance. Foremost, this is a moral and ethical problem. The wealthiest country in the world should not let short-term profiteering get in the way of caring for the sick. Nowhere is this clearer than in our national failure to take care of older Americans. From leaving their care decisions to the mercy of the algorithm to for-profit nursing homes. We must do better, do more to care for our aging population. We must do it with urgency. But our healthcare system also places enormous burdens on working-class Americans of all stripes and persuasions, who often do not have the luxury of generous insurance plans or the disposable income to cover the difference. On these bases alone, we must move faster. Lives literally depend on it. But besides failing to provide care, the system is also exorbitantly expensive, puts enormous strain on our economy more broadly, and has ripple effects throughout the country. Overall, healthcare costs totaled $4.5 trillion in 2022. Of total healthcare spending, Medicare and Medicaid together accounted for approximately 40%. Many people do not realize how much of these government programs spending flows through for-profit companies with high margins. While Medicare has long contracted with insurers to offer privately run plans, they occupied a modest role until the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement Act and Modernization Act, MMA, of 2003. At the time, the bill's proponents said that private plans would provide better coverage at affordable prices, helping, they said, to control the cost of Medicare by using marketplace competition. Instead, Medicare Advantage has become substantially more expensive per patient to American taxpayers than traditional Medicare, and insurers exploit the system to charge the government more. For example, insurers have strong financial incentive to diagnose patients enrolled in their plans with additional conditions whether or not they treat them. A recent Wall Street Journal report found that insurers charged Medicare about $50 billion from 2019 to 2021 for diseases, often unusual, that no doctor treated. None. Insurers earned almost $15 billion from one-hour home visits where nurses just inputted new diagnoses on a tablet, often with scant diagnostic equipment. This is our money. This is your money. Money that comes out of our paychecks in the form of payroll taxes used to fund programs like Medicare, which is a huge source of profit for America's insurers. And unlike federal income taxes, every working American pays for Medicare because it is deducted automatically from your paycheck. Employer-sponsored insurance costs also continue to climb substantially. This is our money too. When employers' healthcare costs increase, workers pay for it, dollar for dollar. Stagnant pay, higher shares of premiums, and reduced coverage. For 3 years, employer premiums have increased by more than 5%, and family premiums for employer-sponsored health care insurance rose 7% this year. When I speak to businesses around the country, what I hear is that the next biggest expense after payroll or salaries is health benefits. The cost of these benefits makes it more difficult for businesses to give workers raises. And as health care costs skyrocket, businesses are shifting more of those costs onto workers, with insurance plans that require them to pay more, higher premiums, higher deductibles, higher copays, higher out-of-pocket minimums. That's money you could be spending on other things that matter to you and your family, and the necessities of life, groceries, gas for your car, education, saving for retirement. In short, American healthcare is struggling. A system that was supposed to introduce competition and efficiency has become less competitive, less efficient, and more wasteful. It presents the gravest and most complex challenges to competition policymakers that we have ever confronted. And today, I would like to discuss the critical role for competition policy and antitrust enforcement to play in these confounding and pressing challenges. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that competition and antitrust is a one-stop shop fix to our healthcare system. That would be naive and unrealistic. But antitrust and competition have an essential role to play. Undeniably, antitrust enforcement and competition policy are core tools, often the best tools, to address problems that flow from consolidation, anti-competitive conduct, and the emergence of increasingly and disproportionately powerful players. So how did we get here? And how can antitrust enforcers, like us, bring the next generation of cases to address the problems we now face? For most of my lifetime, competition policymakers have played healthcare Tetris. Like the game, we looked at whether simplistic blocks line up to create discrete, horizontal, or vertical lines. Antitrust focused on provider markets or insurer markets, without considering whether there are other competitive dynamics at play. Antitrust exclusively used the two-dimensional geometry of vertical and horizontal analysis to focus on markets that were rapidly evolving into multi-sided and multi-dimensional platforms. Antitrust focused on horizontal consolidation in discrete local geographic markets or traditional vertical integration through things like input foreclosure or raising rivals' costs, all of which are valuable and worthwhile issues to examine. Antitrust, unfortunately, however, these simple Tetris-like paradigms bear very little resemblance to the emerging but complex ecosystem that actually confronts patients, healthcare practitioners, and employers. Using outdated modes of analysis and playing healthcare Tetris, antitrust enforcement and policy missed opportunities to assess how broader changes in business, such as the rise of platform business models, healthcare technology, regulatory incentives, impacted competition. In the world of healthcare Tetris, we all agree that horizontal consolidation raises concerns, but failed to look past the two-dimensional geometry to see how these new business relationships intersect. Too often, the antitrust establishment, for them, anything other than straight horizontal merger was so-called vertical integration that would presumptively, in their minds, lead to greater value, lower costs, and more integrated care. This beguilingly simple approach blessed consolidation and entrenchment across vast swaths of the healthcare ecosystem without appropriate consideration for the broader impact and the long-term effects. America's largest healthcare companies are no longer just health insurers or pharmacy benefit managers, and they are no longer just medical groups or hospitals. They are all of the above at once. Meanwhile, consolidated healthcare markets have failed to deliver the promise of better care, lower prices, and increased access. Instead of increasing efficiency, healthcare platform integration and annexation has created perverse incentives, conflicts of interest, and opportunities for self-preferencing, steering, and self-dealing. The physical distance between the caregiver and the patient in the examining room may be measured by inches physically, but it is functionally now miles away due to the pervasive thicket of industry middlemen that figuratively sit in the examining room. The time has come for us to break free from a two-dimensional Tetris-style analysis, which is ill-equipped to address a modern healthcare system defined by massive intermediation platforms. Continued overdependence on these outdated modes of analysis will continue leading us down a path where the problems get bigger and more difficult to address. The academic literature has begun to take note, albeit as a lagging indicator. Research on our decades-long experiment with consolidation in healthcare shows that concentrated markets have led to higher consumer prices, public spending, without accompanying improvements in quality or gains in efficiency. It's led to greater monopsony power and control over the healthcare professionals that dedicate their lives to caring for the sick. Take the rise of pharmacy benefit managers. Many lauded their ascent as a useful counterweight to drug companies and pharmacies. In other words, we needed more bigness, as they said, to discipline big pharma, which may have been, at the time, characterized as a noble and worthy objective. But PBMs have themselves become big. 3 vertically integrated entities now control 80% of the industry, with each enjoying even greater market power at the local level. But have patients and the economy benefit? Instead, it is commonplace now to hear allegations of PBMs self-preferencing and steering to affiliated pharmacies, to the exclusion of others, pushing rebating practices that drive up sticker prices and discourage new drug entry, enabling affiliated insurers to evade medical loss ratios, and tying PBM and medical insurance products. Across healthcare, we see similar concerns: moat building and steering and coercion and regulatory gamesmanship. At the Antitrust Division, we have confronted many of these challenges and characteristics in other industries, including most notably big tech. In effect, we are now witnessing in real time the emergence of big healthcare platforms, and we are at risk of our markets tipping to 1 or 2 major national platforms. The platformization of healthcare contains characteristics that are unfortunately too familiar for us at the Antitrust Division. Multi-level entry. Platform integration and consolidation can be used to stymie competitive threats by increasing the difficulty of entry. If a company has market power in one level of the healthcare system, entry may already be hard enough in that market. But if a single company, can acquire businesses across the healthcare ecosystem and stack, it can further shield itself from competition by forcing a competitor enter at multiple levels at scale just to compete at any single one. We see healthcare companies vertically integrating into this stack now, and the platformization of healthcare can result in creating moats around these healthcare stacks and ecosystems. And this is an extremely concerning development in healthcare where barriers to entry are high and expensive. Conflicts of interest. With the development of healthcare platforms and stacks, We should be concerned about growing conflicts of interest that manifest in ways such as steering, self-preferencing, exclusivity, and other forms of exclusionary and anti-competitive conduct. For example, we see firms with dominant positions choose their own healthcare stack and businesses and excluding independent rivals. Regulatory gamesmanship. One of the reasons that healthcare companies expand could be to circumvent regulatory environments. Healthcare is one of the few markets with cost-based regulations. These regulations, called the medical loss ratio, require insurers to spend at least 80 to 85% of patient premiums on medical care. But insurers could increase prices in contravention of these medical loss ratios by acquiring non-regulated businesses at different levels of the stack and creating healthcare middlemen. For example, pharmacy benefit managers or healthcare providers. This would allow and does allow insurers to regain a greater share of the healthcare spend by paying more money to their affiliates. For example, an unregulated provider wing as costs in a regulated insurance business. Platform expansion and annexation could further enable healthcare companies to exercise market power they have in their insurance business that they would otherwise could not exploit due to the medical loss ratio or in a more competitive open ecosystem. In assessing potential harms from these alarming trends, we must also consider how the loss of independent healthcare practitioners can harm patients and communities. Independent physician practices, community nursing clinics, and independent pharmacies are not are themselves entrepreneurs, but not just that. They are harbingers of self-sustaining communities. These small businesses, especially in small or rural communities, are often the lifeblood of an economically viable and healthy community. The dominance of these large systems, though, not only prevents fair competition and stymies the entry of new competitors, innovators, and business models. It also thwarts badly needed innovation in the organization and the delivery of care. Innovation that is technically and humanly feasible, but not in the self-interest of these huge profitable systems. When our communities are imperiled this way, it is time to look harder at the market structures in which they exist. In doing so, we are likely to find other distress signals, including a decrease in doctors, practitioners, and pharmacists building thriving independent businesses that function as pillars and core infrastructure in their local communities. The American public deserves more from competition policy. We need to return to the common sense principles that motivate the passage of the Clayton and Sherman Acts and that have been accepted and enforced by our courts. It means considering harms other than unilateral effects from horizontal coordination. It means a mix of short-term and long-term strategies that cause harm should come into play when conducting our analyses. It means agencies must critically assess and pursue competition as part of a whole-of-government approach. If we want healthcare to be a market-based industry, then we must invest in healthy market conditions, which must start with competition and choice. We should start with best practices like asking, how does competition actually work in today's economy? We also need to ask ourselves, what do healthcare markets look like today? What pieces of the ecosystem are being purchased? How can data be accumulated, shared, and exploited? Why do these pieces matter for healthcare competition and the price that we have to pay in order to get the fundamental care that we need to stay healthy and to treat our loved ones? Are there harms beyond just price effects? And how do we talk about them in a way that reflects what people experience in healthcare markets and doesn't ignore the humanity of the product at place here, which is taking care of sick people. So let me say this in closing. We are at an inflection point. In technology markets, the world has coalesced around a few global dominant technology stacks. Incumbent technology firms seek to maintain their dominance in any number of ways across markets. And once industries settle into such monopolies, oligopolies, or monopsony companies, it can be hard, very hard, to remedy the situation. In healthcare, I foresee a not-so-distant future where a few integrated healthcare platform stacks will amass a generational hold over healthcare. It would be a private single payer without any of the oversight, impartiality, or scrutiny attendant to government health insurance programs. In 2010, the big insurers promoted a narrative that single payer was a threat to Americans. Nearly 15 years later, we may well be accelerating the march to single payer, just not the kind that anyone imagined in 2010, or not the kind that anyone wants today. The moment for this discussion is now, and the timing is urgent. Thank you.
Thank you, AAG Cantor. Now we're ready for a fireside chat. There's no fire. I don't understand why, but I was told it was just not acceptable.
So over the last 3 years, I've done dozens of fireside chats. No fire. I've sat in dozens of green rooms. Not a single one was green.
Well, okay, so truth in advertising. Maybe let's talk about some things that might end up being a little bit fiery. And I think one thing to emphasize, and Jonathan, an important point you made in your remarks, is that really this is about people. This is about patients. This is about their families. This is about people who are facing huge burdens due to the malfunctioning of one of the most important sectors of our economies: workers, doctors, nearly everybody that comes into touch with this. And I think that's something that really comes first and foremost here, and I'm sure you agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let me kick it off. You're well known at the Antitrust Division for saying that as antitrust enforcers, we should emulate Wayne Gretzky and skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is and not where it's been. Apologies to Mario Lemieux and Cindy Crosby. We dearly beloved them here, and they are wonderful hockey players. But let's talk a little bit. You referred to this in your remarks, but let's talk a little bit more about your sense of where the puck is going to be. What's going on with healthcare markets? Where do you think they're going? What that means for patients, their families, for workers, physicians, everyone, and what that means for antitrust enforcement, and what competition policy should be doing in healthcare.
Yeah, so what we are experiencing is what I just described as the platformization of healthcare. And so can folks hear me? Yeah, so let me explain what I mean by that, which is that, when we initially thought of healthcare, we thought of, okay, you've got a market for your local doctor or physician or caregiver, you have a market for your pharmacy, and you have a market for health insurance, and they all compete in their own little space, whether it was at the industry level or the geographic level. But now what we're seeing is a world where the largest health insurers are the largest healthcare providers, meaning the people who own the insurance company own the doctors, and own the nurses, and own the hospitals, and they own the PBMs, and then they own the technology and the data that sits in between them. And this is now creating an ecosystem of interrelated components, so that to enter at one, you need to enter at all. So that data that is accumulated on one side can be used across in many respects. So that when companies are supposed to be trying to get the best health care, they also care about the bottom line of the insurance. And these conflicts of interest are profound. And in a time when we really should be seeing the development and growth of new and innovative business models that can take on and disrupt these solutions, You need to plug into the platforms. You need to gain access to the provider systems. You need to gain access to the insurance companies. You need to get access to pharmacies and benefits in order to develop these new and innovative products. And that is no longer possible, or is not possible to the extent it should be, because of these closed, mode-protected ecosystems.
Thanks. Let's briefly touch on data and information and sort of use of information technology, because of course it's a topic that is near and dear to the hearts of every single person at Carnegie Mellon Computer U. As part of this, in order to do the best job for the bottom line, to do well in the bottom line, but also do well for patients, access to data is now absolutely crucial. But what happens with the platformization is that everything, including the data, now is inside these silos. Makes it hard for entities outside the silos either to get into the market at all, to compete effectively, or to innovate. Does that strike you as correct?
Absolutely. And so, listen, data and technology and development and growth, I mean, these are all things that have potential to transform healthcare in really beneficial ways. We can use AI and other automated technologies to help develop new treatments and courses of care. I am in no way, shape, or form suggesting that's a problem. I'm saying we need to unleash that innovation. But the problem is if all the access points are captured inside of a moat and become part of an insular ecosystem, then it becomes harder to see the development and growth of those new technologies and business models that might make things more affordable, that might make care better, that might create new jobs, that might allow the caregivers to do their jobs more effectively, and would result in a fair return on investment for the hard work and labor of the people who actually deliver the health care.
Yeah, and unfortunately, of course, fortunately, the use of IT has now become commonplace in healthcare as in every other part of the economy, which is certainly a good thing. But I will remark that one of the very first things IT was used for in the healthcare sector was to maximize revenue, not to improve patient care, not to coordinate care, not to drive down costs, but simply to find the most profitable codes to assign to patients. And that trend has not changed. Let's switch gears and talk about something a little bit different. Many folks in healthcare and in health policy circles have the view that the issue in healthcare is fragmentation and lack of coordination. Those are the major problems in healthcare, and that we need more consolidation between hospitals, doctors, insurers, all of the participants in the healthcare sector to address this problem. I wonder what your thoughts and reactions are to this.
Yeah, I just think that's a fictional narrative. It's just not true. When you talk to people in healthcare, not the people who provide the care and receive the care, they want a more intimate, they want a more direct relationship between the patient, the doctor, and the patient, the nurse, the patient, the caregiver, the patient, the pharmacist. They don't want intermediaries who are not delivering that care to functionally be in the room making decisions without specific knowledge of what's best interest of the patient. I think this idea that the way to solve the problem of big companies exerting too much power is to create more big companies with more power is antithetical to what we need. The fact of the matter is we need innovation, growth, and we need caregivers to have the freedom necessary in order to deliver health care and take care of their patients in the way they see fit.
Thanks. You want to ask me a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Marty, as an academic, tell me a little bit about where you think we can do more going forward to help understand, and as students, what should we be studying to keep pace with these tectonic shifts in how healthcare is delivered, consumed, and both from a clinical perspective as well as the economics of healthcare.
Sure, thanks. So let me say something first about what we do know from research evidence. So first, we have a few decades now of experience with consolidation in healthcare. This is not a new thing. This is going back to the 1970s or the 80s. Just the hospital sector alone has well over 1,600 mergers on a base of about 5,000 hospitals to start with. So huge amount of consolidation, as Jonathan mentioned, lots of acquisitions of physician practices, insurers buying up everything under the sun, et cetera, et cetera. So from a research perspective, the fact that we now have had decades of consolidation means there's evidence that we can look at, and researchers have looked at this evidence. And here's what it says. The evidence does not show that consolidation leads to improved patient care. It does not show that it leads to improved health outcomes for patients. It does not show that it leads to more coordination of care. It does not show that it leads to lower costs. What does it show? It shows it leads to higher prices. It shows it leads to higher spending. It shows, in some instances, that it leads to lower quality care, including increased probability of death, increased mortality for patients who are treated at places that face less potential competition, or in the wake of a merger that eliminated important sources of competition. So I want to be clear about that right now. Academic research, actually, we often think of it as sort of, as one of my colleagues says, as academics, we operate where the rubber meets the sky. And there's some truth to that statement, but the research in this area has actually been very important, and having been on the antitrust enforcement side, I can say that it really makes a difference. Now, we need to do more, and in particular, coming back to your question, I didn't answer your question at all.
No, you're cooking with gas here. Keep going.
But of course, we need more research, and the more recent phenomena we're seeing, particularly with very large health insurers acquiring providers of various kinds, we don't yet have the evidence base, I think, that we'd like to see on that. It raises grave concerns, as you've said. We do have some evidence here and there, but certainly we need to understand more of this. We need to understand what happens across local markets. We see trends that are concerning about what happens when there are acquisitions that cross what we'd normally think of as local geographic markets. That's not understood as well as I think we would like to. So there's certainly scope for more research, and I think this is the kind of thing that folks at Carnegie Mellon excel at. So we want to do cutting rate, rigorous research on important real-world problems that matter. That's what we do here. Advances in theory, advances in methods are very, very important. They enable us to do this kind of work. But fundamentally, this is what we're about here. We're about making a difference in the world. And so I think there are many, many opportunities for students and faculty here to do work that really makes a difference, and to help us as enforcers, as competition policymakers, do our jobs even better.
So another question, and is I talked a bit about how antitrust enforcers and theorists used to view the world in this kind of two-dimensional, up and down, vertical, horizontal, across way. But that, as I mentioned before, the world is becoming more like a platform. Maybe you can explain your experience, as an antitrust expert and someone studying these industries, and explain how that change, or how important it is for us to keep pace with that change in order to get it right.
Yeah, 100%, and thanks. I think that is very important. So I think, in part, what happens in applied areas like this is we do have people who are thinking ahead of the puck, as it were, but often we're reacting to what we see around us. And one of the big antitrust challenges in healthcare literally was the case of hospitals merging with our hospitals. So there was a whole string of mergers, really a wave started happening in the 1980s and 1990s. And the Antitrust Division went to court, the Federal Trade Commission went to court, and the courts decided time and time again in favor of the merging hospitals for what we now know are specious reasons. They really didn't make sense, but the courts were convinced by their arguments. And so a very, very important battle was fought there to try and generate the evidence base and generate both the economic evidence and the legal reasoning and evidence to go back to court, to go after these with a great deal of success. So there was really a laser focus for a long time on exactly that because it was important. I mean, hospitals are almost 6% of national income just on their own. So it was very important, and the antitrust agencies had a lot of difficulty there. So that was the focus, and then what started happening over time is we had more things that were not just hospital, doctor practice, insurer, but cross those kinds of boundaries. So people started thinking about those, but I think as you mentioned, there had been a prevailing wisdom in antitrust for a long time that if you had mergers like that, they were benign or maybe actually very beneficial. And so we needed to go back and start rethinking, both as economists and lawyers, about these kinds of mergers. And there was a lot of thinking that emerged that said, well, not so fast, not necessarily. And evidence started accumulating on that. So now I think where we're at, and I'm finally getting around to your point. Look, I'm a professor. I talk for a long time.
I love it.
Yeah,
keep
anybody
rolling.
taking a nap, it's okay, but it will be on the final at the end of this thing. Okay, so now we realize, I think, and this is your point, that thinking in these boxes, hospital, doctor, whatever, that's no longer what we're seeing, and that doesn't make sense. That we were restricting our thinking and not doing the job we should be doing as enforcers. Because guess what? The market participants aren't restricting themselves to those boxes. They're doing all kinds of things. And we should not be in the position of always having to play catch up or looking at things through a lens that doesn't really fit the phenomenon we're examining.
Got it. And so one question I think maybe for both of us is, how should we think about labor? I use the word monopsony in remarks. And for those who don't know what monopsony is, it's essentially power over inputs. And that could be suppliers, but in recent years, it's been focused on how big, powerful companies can squeeze people who work. And this is extremely important in healthcare, where the people who work are the difference between life and death, and the nurse to patient ratio, or the amount of compensation, travel time, and burden on and the ability to earn a living wage from being in the healthcare ecosystem matters. And so how do we think, and how do you think we should think about labor in the context of this broader platformization of healthcare?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a key part. It's inherently a part of what we're talking about. As we start talking at the outset, this is all about people, and the people we're talking about here are people who work in healthcare. Well, we can have the best information technology in the world, the best medical devices in the world, the best pharmaceuticals, but without skilled and caring healthcare workers, that's not going to be effective. I know there are some computer scientists who think AI will take care of everything. I don't think that's where we're going or where we're at yet. So if people are not in situations where they have decent working conditions, they get paid fairly, they have the time to give patients the care that they need and to think about the kind of care patients need, then obviously the people that are workers suffer directly, but so will the patients as well, so will our healthcare system. So I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I think it goes to the concept of a platform or a middleman, right? And so when you think about healthcare, you have, let's say, a doctor and a patient, right? If more value is being captured in the middle, the patient is getting less in terms of quality of care, less in terms of attention, and the caregiver is getting less in terms of being compensated for giving that care, and more is being captured in the middle, we have a problem. And I think when you have these massive platforms that have different ways to move shells around in order to capture more in the middle, it creates a problem. What we need to do is we need to reduce the distance, the metaphorical distance, not the physical distance, between the caregiver and the patient. And we need to make sure that more value is going to the people who give the care and people who receive the care.
Yeah, and yet another thing that certainly we've talked about a great deal is when we have these platforms, if they lock up key resources, we're talking about data earlier, but now we're talking about people. If they lock up key healthcare workers, if they lock up doctors, so they're not accessible to other potential competitors, then we got a problem. That's yet another way that this can manifest itself. And I think your point about sort of there are so many different junctures, so many different points where competition is affected and can be harmed, that makes this particularly difficult.
Yeah. And so as you've been in the antitrust community for a long time, maybe you can give us some insights as to how you've seen that the things evolve, good, bad, or otherwise, and where do you think we are now looking ahead at the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well, because you've been around the block a few times.
Couple.
As well. I think we both have a little bit of gray in our hair to show for it. Well, I think actually it's my kids probably that did that to me more than antitrust. So, as I said earlier, I think that for a long time we had this intense, really laser focus on mergers of like to like. And I think there were good reasons for that. We have evolved to now thinking about this in a more holistic way. And really the challenge going forward for us will be to try and get to where the puck is going to be here and maintain the focus and the attention on this. And you alluded to this earlier. This is actually extremely challenging. The antitrust division and the FTC have taken on, for example, big tech. And we've had some really remarkable successes in that area, but it has taken a lot of investment on the part of the antitrust division. I'm sure it's true at the Federal Trade Commission as well, in terms of getting our minds around how do we think about this and what's the evidence base for this, and thinking about legal theories and legal approaches. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV, so I won't attempt to speak to that directly. But we know that it's been a lot of effort devoted to thinking about not just what's coming over the transom right now, but what we see as the challenges going forward. And I think that's going to be very, very important for the Antitrust Division and for the Federal Trade Commission going forward to pay attention to what pops up that has to be done, but to not lose sight of the fact that things are evolving and evolving very rapidly, and we have to constantly be investing in our thinking and our knowledge in order to stay on top of those things and doing what we've been charged to doing with what we are obligated to do, and that is serving all Americans.
Yeah, it's a great point. Listen, I mean, we've been thinking, for example, about big tech for well over a decade now, and as you mentioned, we've had significant activity at the Antitrust Division and a fair bit of success in that regard. People often say, well, how come you're so focused on tech? Well, I think there are good reasons for that, saying, well, tech itself is hugely impactful and affects our lives in so many different ways. But I was, also at the time we were doing this, very mindful that the characteristics we were seeing in big tech were likely to become characteristics that will define almost every other industry. Healthcare, energy, agriculture, where data and conglomeration and scale all become prominent and prevalent, and where the multi-sided markets and marketplaces are likely to emerge. And so I think a lot of the work that we've done trying to figure out and untangle antitrust issues in the context of big tech has been very valuable in paying dividends as we now think about markets such as healthcare that start to exhibit very similar characteristics. And I think we need to make sure that we take those learnings and we abstract them out to ensure that we can apply them to other markets. The other thing I think we learned along the way is when the facts and the models don't line up, the problem is not with the facts, right? And I think one of the things and one of the problems in our antitrust community had been that we became too beholden to very stylized models of how markets work. And then we would get problems, whether it's cases or investigations, and we would try to fit them into those models. And I think that failed us because markets are dynamic, they're complex, and they're multidimensional. And sometimes models can be a very useful tool to help us understand and conceptualize how things work. But if we start fitting facts into models, we lose the plot. And I think when we started confronting big tech, we realized that, okay, things like horizontal and vertical effects are no longer applicable in the same way they once were. That the role of data, incentives, short-term profit maximization in a world where companies generate value through stock price or valuation or exit, is different than the economic realities that we were confronting 30 or 40 years ago. And unless we adapt and modernize our approach to how we understand markets, we won't be able to adapt and modernize approach to how we enforce the antitrust laws and how we develop sound policies to address the problems and challenges that flow from the developments and changes in those markets.
Yeah, 100%. I remember, it was now probably more like 11 years ago when I was the chief economist at the Federal Trade Commission, having coffee with my counterpart from the Antitrust Division. And we were talking about big tech, which was not nearly as salient then, but certainly we were aware of it, and saying, I'm not sure I understand this or I know how to think straight about it. This is something we collectively at the enforcement agencies really need to devote a lot of attention to. So I agree with you. I think big tech, the silver lining was it got our attention and forced us to realize the frameworks we have don't fit this. We need to think outside the box. And the other thing I think also that happened was we had less success in court than we thought we should. And in spite of everything we were doing, we were seeing increases in market power in many, many parts of the economy. And that sounded alarm bells for a lot of people. And healthcare, as we've been talking about now for quite some time, is certainly one of those sectors. Let me ask you another question. What is the Antitrust Division doing? What are major initiatives that are being undertaken at the Antitrust Division with regard to healthcare, both with regard to enforcement, competition policy, more generally?
Sure.
What are we doing now? What's on the horizon?
So I'll start at 1,000 feet and then kind of dive down. Yeah. But for starters, we have adapted our frameworks. We are now focused on industry expertise, people like you and others. We are focused on getting out of some of these horizontal and vertical boxes and thinking about markets in a more dynamic way. We are, and I'm sure this will warm the hearts of people in the room on campus here, when we think about bringing in experts, we're not just thinking about economists who provide tremendous value, but we are hiring units of data scientists to think about how we analyze problems and how we understand how technology and markets intersect. We are meeting the world where it is. We are increasing our focus on labor and antitrust enforcement as it affects people who work to make sure that monopsony power doesn't result in people who are working hard have the ability to get fair return for their labor. We are thinking about development and creating openings and oxygen for new companies and startups and businesses to actually thrive and compete without necessarily having to match the scale of the biggest, largest players. And so we are changing the way we bring these cases to courts. And I think some of the learnings that you talked about from a number of years ago, what we've said is we need to start not just investigating where the facts are, but we need to start going to court and telling courts and judges not to look at models, but to look at facts and to look at the law. Because when we present the facts as they are, and we present the law as it is, we actually have many of the ingredients we need for success. And we've proven over the last 3 years that we can be quite successful, both in our litigation efforts as well as our policy initiatives. In terms of healthcare, we have a lot more that needs to be done, and I hope that work will continue, because these are problems that are existential. We need to make sure that we're caring for our aging population. We need to make sure that we're meeting healthcare markets where they are. We need to make sure that people who are want to invest their careers to be health caregivers, to be nurses, to be doctors. We want to make sure that people who have new innovations and technologies and businesses are going into healthcare so that they can interoperate with the existing ecosystems, not feeling like they are participating in walled gardens. This is the work we're doing. We've created a multidisciplinary task force at the Antitrust Division, and we started bringing cases, including one today, involving payer-provider consolidation relating to in-home healthcare and hospice. And so we are going to continue to, at least through the short remaining tenure that I have, but hopefully for the foreseeable future, making sure that we are accelerating our efforts and bringing an enforcement agenda that works for the public.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that we're also doing is we're working very closely with other government agencies.
Yes.
So we've had many and continue ongoing discussions with folks in the Department of Health and Human Services, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Office of Personnel Management, Department of Labor, Consumer Financial Protection Board, many different government agencies, because competition policy, of course, is antitrust enforcement, but there are things that rules, the ways Medicare or Medicaid pays providers, et cetera, that have profound impact on structure in markets and competition. And we've been working very closely with them in a number of ways as well. So one last question, and then we'll have time for some questions from the audience. If we and subsequent folks are successful with antitrust enforcement and competition policy, what does healthcare look like in the U.S. in 10 years or 20 years?
So if we are successful, then it means sitting here, we can't answer that question, right? Competition is about the beauty of uncertainty. It's about the innovations we can't yet conceive. It's about the innovations that we can't yet imagine. It's about things that will make our systems better, our people healthier. So that's one, right? But it does mean that people can afford healthcare more easily. It means that people want to go into the business of delivering and providing healthcare because they feel like those are careers that are not just worthwhile from a moral perspective, but also one that can sustain a family and make ends meet. It means that we have choice and innovation. It means that people can start businesses in rural communities, and small businesses don't just have to be tech startups. Small businesses can be a medical practice, a local doctor that is serving her local community and seeing people from the local farms who need medical attention. It means that all of those doors open up, and it means that the next generation of innovators and technology and people like you who are coming up with new, interesting, untold ways to solve difficult problems have entry and access points into the market so that you can compete effectively.
I'd add to that, and I know this is near and dear to your heart as well as mine, that the least fortunate among us have access to the care that they need and they deserve.
Thank you. I mean, we are heading into a world where healthcare will become accessible, affordable to the rich, where margins are higher because people tend to be healthier, and where folks who are disadvantaged and who don't have access to the same kind of things that people like you and I have access to will find themselves on the short end of stick, where data can be used to gauge underwriting risk so that the people who are less fortunate and the most vulnerable get the least amount of care and coverage because they're the most expensive. Those are the kinds of problems that we need to address head on.
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
Jonathan. We now have time for a few questions. Do we have a microphone? Okay, so just raise your hand, and since this is a big room, we don't have a mic, I'll just have to ask someone to speak very loudly. Yeah, Lee, if you could stand up and...
Happy to stand up and be loud. Mr. Cannon,
I knew I could count on you.
yeah. Thank you so much for coming, sharing your views. So one of the other things that distinguishes U.S. healthcare is that some of our practitioners are extremely well compensated, and that compensation reflects restrictions on entry into medical practice itself. Right, the number of slots in medical schools is restricted. Right, the number of specialist training slots is restricted. Providers from overseas are restricted in terms of their ability to come here and practice, and it's difficult to move from practice in one state to another. Are any of these restrictions on competition something that you can imagine public policy contending with in the near future?
Absolutely. I mean, lowering barriers to entry and switching, inviting more people into the system who have something to contribute and offer is absolutely essential. And so regulatory barriers that prevent that are worth addressing. And this is something that we see in the legal community where bar associations have for generations restricted the ability of qualified professionals to participate in the legal industry. I will say, though, that to me is difficult and as concerning some of those restrictions may be, they're not nearly as concerning as non-compete restrictions. I hear almost on a daily basis, that non-compete restrictions, and they're most acute in the medical community, in the healthcare industry, prevent the kind of switching and prevent the kind of mobility and opportunity that is necessary to have not only fairly compensated workers, but enough workers to provide the kind of health care that we need. And I think it is an issue that we need to address with urgency.
Yes, please stand up and speak up. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I'm actually a student professor at Gainer's health economics class, so very happy to be here. I had a question about drug pricing and Medicare, actually. So given that the Biden administration is coming to an end, and there was clearly some effort to focus on the loss of exclusivity and the Inflation Reduction Act and put price caps on insulin and those sort of things, how do you anticipate the next administration even further on tackling that issue, and how do you anticipate just the whole healthcare industry focusing on that from a government perspective?
Yeah, so there's a great question. What's going to happen going forward, particularly around the cost of pharmaceutical pricing and a number of the developments that have taken place over the last 4 years in the current administration. I certainly don't know, and it'll be up to the next administration to make the wise decisions, and I hope that they will. And if they do, I certainly will be cheering them on. The fact of the matter is, the public needs to hold its leaders accountable. And there's an opportunity, and I think Americans are saying quite loudly that the cost of pharmaceuticals and life-saving drugs is too high. The cost of health care is too high. The access to health care too difficult. And so hopefully we will continue to see progress in that area, but it really ultimately will be up to the public to speak with its voice in numerous different respects if the answers are not what they want. But hopefully, the positive progress that we've made in that front will continue.
I think we have time for one more question. Jim.
Thank you for an excellent talk. As I was listening, I wanted to understand, what is it about healthcare that has made the consolidation not bring it's almost antithetical to what you would think. Is it the amount of consolidation that's happened in regions that has been the problem? In other words, some amount of consolidation might have led to cost savings and better care because of the competition that would ensue, but because we allowed it to become so consolidated in regions, there is no competition, and so they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think the concern in healthcare, it's on two different fronts. One, it's the amount of consolidation, the amount of power. When you see a tremendous amount of power get consolidated in a small number of players, whether it's healthcare or any other industry, you're going to see alarm bells go off. But the thing that becomes particularly problematic in these kind of platform-like markets is you have, for example, conflicts of interest, right? And so when you're essentially representing the buyer and the seller at the same time, right, it creates this massive conflict of interest, and sort of the natural market forces that were supposed to keep each other in check no longer can play out. When you have a world where to enter at one level, you have to enter at multiple levels at once, and you have to do so at scale, it creates a problem. When you have shortages of skilled labor, and at the same time, people don't have the proper incentives to enter into the workforce because it's too difficult, too painful, or not, where you can't get return on investment enough, it becomes a problem. And so I think one of the things that I tried to emphasize with the discussion today is that in order, these are not like factories where you might like have vertical integration between a supplier or a factory and a manufacturer or a machine maker, right? Like, you're not talking about like, widgets fitting into each other. You're talking about marketplaces that were supposed to sit at different levels who are now being, operated under the same umbrella. And the traditional market forces and models that we expected to work no longer function the same way. And so I think we need to do a better job updating and modernizing our understanding of those market realities.
So I'll respond briefly. Raising price is easy. Cutting costs, improving quality is hard. Once you've merged and competition has been harmed, you can turn right around and go back and negotiate, raise your price. That's very straightforward. If you actually want to integrate, not just acquire or consolidate, but integrate, that is a huge amount of work. If you really want to cut costs in a thoughtful, meaningful way, if you really want to improve quality, that is really hard work. And I think it is that simple. Once the merger has happened or some kind of consolidation has happened, and these firms don't have to compete, well, they turn around and raise price. But nobody's pushing them anymore to improve their quality, to cut their costs. And so they don't, because they don't have to. And it doesn't matter at all if they are formally a not-for-profit or a for-profit firm. There's $4.5 trillion at stake, as Jonathan said, and everybody's chasing after that money.
Right. And when the money is spread out under the same company in so many different parts of a business, it's really hard to figure out where it's going.
Exactly.
And so you can, when, there used to be this sort of, assumption of, oh, well, you eliminate double marginalization, but now we're seeing marginalization pop up everywhere, and you can't quite figure out exactly where. And so a lot of these, embedded assumptions that were animating the work that people in the antitrust community were doing have been proven wrong. And I think we need to do a better job, calling it like it is.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us here at Heinz College.